The alarm did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like the whole training dome was screaming. I was on my back before I even understood I had fallen. The floor under me was shaking, and red light poured down from the ceiling vents in slow, heavy pulses. Around me, cadets from 6 different worlds were scrambling, sliding, grabbing at railings that were not there. My own hands were shaking so hard I could not get a grip on my harness buckle. "Report," our instructor's voice cracked through the comm system. "Report positions, now." Nobody reported anything. Nobody could. The dome's outer wall, 300 meters of reinforced plating, built to survive artillery, was groaning like a living thing in pain. I am Cale Dresch, a cadet of the Thren Fleet Academy, and until that morning I believed I understood what the word danger meant. I had studied it. I had passed exams on it. I had never once felt it crawl up the back of my neck like a living insect, until the day the sky above Deck 7 turned the color of a bruise. We were only supposed to be running a basic weather response drill, a simple one. Rain, some wind, maybe a controlled lightning strike from the dome's simulation array, just enough to teach us how to move as a unit under pressure. That was what the schedule said. That was what the instructors had promised the 17 of us standing in the departure bay 2 hours earlier, nervous and proud in our fresh cadet uniforms. Then the actual weather system arrived early, and it was nothing like the schedule. I remember the moment the simulation array shut itself down. A soft chime, almost polite, and then a mechanical voice announcing that natural atmospheric conditions had exceeded safe parameters for continued simulation. In other words, the storm outside had become too dangerous for the machine pretending to make a storm, so the machine gave up and let the real one in. That should have told me everything. It did not yet. I was still thinking about grades, about the report I would need to file, about how my parents back on Thren Prime would react if I failed my first field exercise. My homeworld does not have storms like the one bearing down on us. My homeworld barely has weather at all. Thren Prime's climate towers keep every city at a gentle 22 degrees, every season mild, every rainfall scheduled 2 weeks in advance and announced by a soft chime so nobody is surprised by so much as a drizzle. I had never seen real lightning before that day. I had only seen it in training videos, slowed down, narrated calmly by a voice explaining electrical discharge in the atmosphere. The videos did not shake. They did not crack the air apart like something enormous had been torn in half. They did not make my chest hurt. "Cale!" Someone shouted my name, and I turned to see Finn Ashworth, one of my bunkmates, crawling toward me across the tilting floor. Finn was from a world called Doran, a place of quiet oceans and gentle tides, and his face had gone the pale gray color his species turns when they are afraid. "Cale, the outer door, it's not sealing." I looked past him, toward the enormous door that separated our shelter deck from the drop zone outside, and I understood why his voice had cracked. Water was coming in around the edges of it, not a trickle, a steady cold sheet, already pooling at our boots. Then I heard something that did not fit. In the middle of all that noise, all that fear, I heard laughter. Not cruel laughter, not the laughter of someone enjoying our terror, just plain, easy, delighted laughter, the kind you might hear from someone watching a very good sunset. I turned toward the sound, and I saw her. Her name was Aria Nolan, and she was the only human in our entire training class. I had heard the rumors about her file before I ever met her in person. The other cadets whispered that her homeworld's classification carried a warning label most of us had never seen attached to an inhabited planet before. The word on that label was simple, and somehow it had frightened half the barracks more than the storm currently trying to break down our door. Deathworld. I had thought it was an exaggeration, a nickname some overzealous fleet clerk had attached to Earth because humans like dramatic titles. Standing there with water rising around my ankles and thunder rattling my teeth, I was beginning to reconsider that assumption. Aria was crouched near the failing door, not away from it like the rest of us, but toward it, studying the water pouring in with the same expression someone might use to examine an interesting puzzle. Her uniform was soaked through already. her dark hair plastered to her forehead, and she was smiling. Actually smiling. "You find this funny?" I shouted over the noise, more out of disbelief than anger. She glanced back at me, and there was nothing mocking in her expression. If anything, she looked almost sympathetic, the way you might look at someone seeing snow for the very first time. "I find it familiar," she said, and her voice was steady in a way that made no sense given everything happening around us. "This is nothing. Back home, we'd call this a light afternoon shower." Behind her, our instructor, a broad-shouldered Vantic officer named Commander Oren Voss, was shouting orders into his comm unit, trying to raise the shuttle crew stationed outside. His voice had none of its usual calm command tone. It was tight, clipped, worried in a way I had never heard from him before. "This exercise is being aborted," he announced to all of us. "I repeat, this exercise is aborted. All cadets, remain in the shelter deck. Do not, under any circumstances, attempt to reach the drop zone." That instruction should have been unnecessary. Nobody in their right mind wanted to go anywhere near that door. Nobody except Arya, apparently, who was already reaching for the emergency release lever beside it. "What are you doing?" Finn asked her, his voice climbing half an octave. "There's a maintenance crew stuck out there," Arya said simply, nodding toward a small display screen bolted to the wall beside the door, one most of us had been too panicked to even notice. It showed a live feed from outside, grainy through the rain, but clear enough to make out 3 figures huddled against an overturned equipment crate, pinned down by wind and water. They were setting up the weather sensors before the storm jumped ahead of schedule. "Commander Voss is trying to reach them on comms, but their equipment is probably shorted out by now." I stared at the screen, and my stomach dropped. She was right. I could just make out the shapes of 3 crew members, and even from that distance, I could tell they were in trouble. "The door won't hold if you open it," I said. "The water pressure alone." "I'm not opening the main door," Arya said, already moving toward a smaller access hatch built into the wall beside it, one designed for exactly this kind of emergency. "There's a secondary route. It's tighter, and it's not built for the storm, but it'll get me to them faster than waiting for the shuttle crew to suit up." Commander Voss turned at that moment, his eyes widening as he registered what she intended to do. "Cadet Nolan, stand down," he ordered. "That is not an authorized action." "With respect, sir," Arya said, already pulling a rain shell over her uniform. "By the time it's authorized, they'll be in the water. I want to tell you that I understood, in that moment, what kind of person she was. I did not. I only understood that I was terrified, that the storm outside sounded like the end of the world, and that a girl half my size was preparing to walk directly into it, while the rest of us clung to railings and prayed the walls would hold." "You're actually going out there," I said, and it was not really a question. Arya paused at the hatch, glancing back at me one more time. Rain was already blowing sideways through the narrow gap she had opened, cold and sharp against my face, even from 10 meters away. Thunder rolled overhead again, long and deep, and I flinched hard enough to bang my elbow against the railing. She did not flinch. She did not even blink. "KL," she said, and there was something almost gentle in the way she said my name, like she understood exactly how strange this must look to someone who had never known weather that could hurt you. "I promise you, this storm is not trying to kill anyone. It's just doing what storms do. You just have to know how to move with it instead of against it." Then she looked past me, out toward the gray chaos beyond the hatch, toward 3 people who needed help and a sky that had frightened an entire class of alien cadets into paralysis, and she smiled again, wider this time, like she was greeting an old friend she had not seen in years. "Besides," she added, stepping through the hatch and into the wind, "the weather's perfect." The hatch sealed behind her with a heavy clunk, and for several long seconds, none of us moved. None of us spoke. We simply stood there in the flooding shelter deck, staring at the small screen, showing her figure appear at the edge of the frame. Walking steadily into a storm, the rest of us could barely survive standing still. Commander Voss was the first to break the silence, though his voice had lost every trace of the authority it usually carried. "Somebody get me a line to the surface team," he said quietly. "Now." I looked at Finn. Finn looked at me. Neither of us said what we were both thinking, which was some version of the same impossible question. What kind of world produces someone who smiles at that? The screen beside the hatch was the only window we had into what was happening outside, and I could not look away from it, even though every part of me wanted to. Arya's shape moved through the gray static of the storm feed like something that belonged there. She kept low, one arm raised against the wind, picking her path across the flooding ground in a way that looked almost lazy, until you noticed how precisely she avoided every hazard. A fallen support beam, a live cable sparking against wet metal, a section of ground already collapsing under the weight of standing water. She stepped around each one without slowing down, as if she had memorized the terrain before the storm ever arrived. "How is she reading the ground like that?" Finn whispered beside me. His species has excellent low-light vision, better than mine, and even he sounded baffled. "It's completely flooded, you can't see what's underneath." "Maybe she can't see it either," I said. "Maybe she's just guessing." Neither of us believed that. Guessing does not look that calm. Commander Voss had abandoned trying to order her back and was instead shouting coordinates into his comm unit, relaying her position to the shuttle crew who were still grounded, unable to lift off safely in wind that strong. I heard him mention wind shear values that made the other instructor beside him go quiet. I did not understand the numbers, but I understood the silence that followed them. On the screen, Arya reached the overturned equipment crate where the 3 stranded crew members were sheltering. I watched her crouch beside them, her mouth moving, though the audio pickup was too distorted by wind noise to make out words. One of the crew members, a young Vantic technician barely older than us, was clutching his arm against his chest in a way that made my stomach twist. Even from that distance, it was clear something was wrong with it. "He's hurt," I said. "She sees it too," Finn said, pointing. Arya had already shifted her attention to the injured technician, running her hands carefully along his arm, checking something the rest of us could not see from the feed. Then she looked up, toward the equipment crate itself, and began working at the straps holding a supply case in place. "What is she doing now?" I asked, mostly to myself. I got my answer a moment later when she pulled a length of rigid support material from the case and began fashioning it into a makeshift splint. Her movements quick and sure, despite the wind trying to tear everything out of her hands. She was not panicking. She was not even hurrying, not really. She worked with the unbothered efficiency of someone assembling a simple piece of furniture on a calm afternoon, except the wind around her was strong enough to bend a support beam we had watched fall only minutes earlier. "Where does someone learn to do that?" Finn asked, and this time his voice had less fear in it and more something else. Wonder, maybe, or the beginning of it. I did not have an answer. I only had questions, and they were multiplying faster than I could keep track of them. The storm chose that moment to remind us it was not finished. A gust of wind hit the equipment crate hard enough to shift it several centimeters across the flooded ground, and on the screen I watched all 3 crew members brace themselves against the sudden movement. Arya did not brace. She simply adjusted her stance a half-second before the gust arrived, like she had felt it coming before it hit. "She predicted that," I said, my voice quieter now. "Predicted what?" "The wind. She moved before it hit her. Look at the timing." Finn leaned closer to the screen, and I watched his expression shift from confusion to something closer to disbelief. "That's not possible. Nobody can predict wind direction that precisely without instruments." "She doesn't have instruments," I said. "She has whatever passes for instincts on a Deathworld." The word tasted strange in my mouth as I said it, less like an insult now, and more like a simple description of fact. Commander Voss's voice cut through our conversation, sharp with urgency. "Shuttle crew reports a break in wind speed in approximately 90 seconds. If she can get all 3 crew members mobile by then, we have a window for extraction. 90 seconds. On the screen, Arya was already moving, helping the injured technician to his feet with one arm while gesturing the other two crew members toward a cleared path she had apparently already mapped out in her head. She moved like a conductor directing an orchestra through a piece of music the rest of us could not hear. I found myself holding my breath, which was strange, because I was safe inside the shelter deck. I was not the one out there in weather that could apparently break support beams and knock trained fleet technicians off their feet. And yet my chest felt tight, watching her guide 3 frightened, injured people across ground that looked like it wanted to swallow them. 60 seconds, Voss called out. Arya had the group moving now, cutting across the flooded field toward a slight rise in the terrain, a place where the water was shallower and the ground more solid. She kept the injured technician close to her side, his good arm draped over her shoulders, taking his weight without any visible strain, despite him being considerably larger than her. Lightning split the sky again, closer this time, close enough that the thunder arrived almost instantly after the flash, and the whole shelter deck flinched as one. I heard someone behind me let out a small, frightened sound. On the screen, none of the 4 figures out in the storm so much as flinched. "How does she stay that calm?" I asked, not really expecting an answer. 30 seconds, Voss announced. "Shuttle crew is prepping the extraction line now." I watched Arya reach the rise in the terrain, just as a shape descended through the rain above her, a hover pallet dropping from the shuttle, circling somewhere above the storm clouds, close enough now to send ripples across the flooded ground beneath it. She helped load the injured technician onto the pallet first, then the other 2 crew members, her movements never once slowing despite the wind trying to knock the pallet sideways. Then, with all 3 crew members secured, she simply straightened up, looked directly into the storm feed camera as though she somehow knew exactly where it was, and gave a small, casual wave. The audio pickup caught one final fragment of sound before the pallet lifted away, carrying her voice thin and distorted through the wind, but unmistakably relaxed. Piece of cake. The shelter deck erupted into noise the moment the pallet cleared the storm's lower cloud layer, cadets shouting and cheering in 6 different languages, some crying with relief, others simply staring at the screen in stunned silence. Commander Voss allowed himself exactly 3 seconds of visible relief before his professional composure returned, and he began issuing orders for medical teams to meet the returning pallet at the secondary bay. I did not cheer. I did not cry. I stood very still, watching the screen go dark as the storm feed camera lost its connection, and I tried to understand what I had just witnessed. Finn nudged my shoulder. "You okay?" "I don't know what I just saw," I admitted. "You saw a human walk into a storm that scared an entire training class, half to death, rescue 3 people, and call it a piece of cake," Finn said slowly, like he was testing whether the words made any more sense out loud than they did in his head. They did not. The hatch beside us cycled open a few minutes later, and Arya stepped back through it, soaked from head to foot, hair plastered flat against her face, mud streaked up one side of her uniform. She looked, in every visible way, like someone who had just walked through the worst weather any of us had ever seen. She also looked completely fine. "Cold out there," she said cheerfully, shaking water from her sleeve like it was a minor inconvenience rather than a survival situation. Good thing it wasn't actually bad weather, or I'd have needed a jacket. A few cadets laughed nervously, unsure if she was joking. I was fairly certain she was not. Commander Voss approached her, his expression a complicated mixture of relief, professional concern, and something that looked suspiciously like fear. "Cadet Nolan," he said carefully, "that was an unauthorized action that violated at least 4 separate safety protocols." "Understood, sir," Arya said, straightening into something approximating attention, though the effect was somewhat undermined by the puddle forming around her boots. "It also worked, sir." Voss studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, the way it does when someone recalculates an assumption they had been carrying for a long time. "Yes," he said finally, "it did." He turned to address the rest of us, his voice regaining its usual command tone, though I noticed it took him a visible effort to find it again. This exercise is concluded. All cadets will return to their quarters for debrief in 1 hour. Cadet Nolan, report to the medical bay for evaluation. Standard procedure following field exposure. I'm fine, sir, Arya said. I did not ask whether you were fine, cadet. I asked you to report to medical. Yes, sir. As the crowd of cadets began filing toward the exit corridors, still murmuring to each other in stunned disbelief, I found myself walking beside Arya, matching her pace without quite deciding to do so. Can I ask you something? I said. You've been wanting to ask me something since the moment you saw that file with my homeworld's classification on it, Arya said, not unkindly. Go ahead. That storm, I said, was it really nothing to you? Truthfully. Arya considered the question with more seriousness than I expected, wiping rain from her face with the back of her hand before answering. Truthfully, she said, it was a decent storm, strong winds, good lightning, solid rainfall. Back home, we'd probably close the schools for it. Maybe cancel a few flights. That doesn't sound like nothing. It's not nothing, she agreed. It's just not new. There's a difference between something being dangerous and something being unfamiliar. Most of what scares people isn't actually the danger. It's not knowing the shape of it. I turned that over in my mind as we walked, the water from her soaked uniform leaving a thin trail behind her on the corridor floor. And you know the shape of it, I said. The storm's shape. Arya smiled, though this one was smaller and quieter than the one she had given the storm camera. I grew up learning it, she said. Everyone where I'm from does, eventually. You either learn the shape of the danger, or the danger teaches you the hard way. My planet doesn't really offer a third option. I did not have a response to that. I only had a growing, uncomfortable feeling that everything I had believed about the word Deathworld, everything the whispered rumors in the barracks had built it into, was smaller and stranger, and somehow more remarkable than any of us had imagined. We reached the junction where the medical bay corridor split from the cadet quarters, and Arya paused, glancing back at me with an expression that was almost apologetic. You're staring at me like I grew a second head, she said. Sorry, I said. It's just, I've never met anyone who smiles at a storm like that. Give it time, Arya said, already turning down the medical corridor. You might be surprised what starts to look ordinary once you've seen where I'm from. I stood at that junction for a long moment after she disappeared around the corner, thinking about the word ordinary and wondering exactly what kind of world could make a storm like that feel small. The debrief that followed was unlike any I had sat through before. Usually these sessions were dry, procedural, full of instructors reading incident reports in flat, measured voices. This one felt different from the moment Commander Voss stepped up to address us, because his hands were not quite steady around the datapad he was holding. What happened today was not part of the planned curriculum, he said. The weather system that struck the training dome exceeded every safety threshold we had prepared for. By every standard measure available to this academy, today's exercise should have resulted in serious injury, possibly worse. He paused, and I watched him choose his next words carefully. It did not, because one cadet made a decision that the rest of us were not prepared to make. Nobody needed him to say her name. Every head in the room, whether it had 2 eyes or 6, whether it breathed air or something closer to gas, turned toward the same empty seat near the back, the one Arya would have occupied if she were not still finishing her evaluation in the medical bay. I want to be clear, Voss continued, that what Cadet Nolan did today was, on paper, a violation of protocol. I also want to be clear that if she had waited for authorization, we would likely be having a very different conversation right now. This academy trains cadets from worlds where danger is rare, where storms are managed, where the environment itself is not something you must constantly negotiate with. Cadet Nolan's homeworld does not offer that luxury. What we witnessed today was not recklessness. It was competence, developed under conditions the rest of us can barely imagine. I thought about that word, competence, for the rest of the evening. It did not match the picture the word Deathworld had painted in my mind before that day. I had imagined something wild, something barely under control. What I had actually seen was precision. Calm, deliberate, practiced precision, applied to a situation that had left the rest of us frozen at the first clap of thunder. 3 days later, the schedule for our next field exercise arrived, and the moment I saw it, my stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the storm from before. We were being sent to Halvorn Ridge, a training biome 3 hours from the academy by shuttle, known among senior cadets for one very specific reason. It was the only environment in the entire training program deliberately left unmanaged. No simulation array, no climate control, no safety net beyond the instructors accompanying us and the emergency beacons clipped to our uniforms. Just raw, unfiltered wilderness, and whatever weather happened to be moving through it on any given day. They wouldn't send us there so soon after what happened, Finn said as we packed our gear that morning, though his voice carried the particular tone of someone hoping to be told they were right, rather than believing it. They're sending us there because of what happened, I said. Voss said it himself. They want us learning what Arya already knows. How do you think they plan to teach us that, if not by putting us somewhere the weather can actually teach us something? Finn did not have an answer for that, and neither did I want one, honestly. The shuttle ride to Halvorn Ridge was quiet in a way that felt heavier than the noise of the storm 3 days earlier. 17 cadets sat in careful silence, most of us watching the viewport as the training dome shrank behind us and the wild green ridgeline ahead grew larger, closer, more real. Arya sat near the front, chatting easily with the shuttle pilot about wind patterns and cloud formations, pointing out shapes in the sky the rest of us could not begin to read. She looked, if anything, more relaxed than she had at the start of any previous exercise. "You're not worried at all," I said, sliding into the seat beside her. "Should I be? Everyone else is." Arya glanced around the shuttle cabin, taking in the tense shoulders, the fidgeting hands, the careful, controlled breathing of cadets, trying not to show how frightened they were. "I've noticed," she said. "For what it's worth, that's a completely reasonable reaction. Fear keeps you alive, when it's pointed at the right things. The trick isn't getting rid of it. It's learning what deserves it, and what doesn't. And this ridge, does it deserve it?" She considered the question honestly, which I had come to appreciate about her. She never simply told people what they wanted to hear. "A little," she admitted. "There's a weather front moving in from the coast, and the terrain here has some steep drainage channels that can flood fast if the rain gets heavy enough. That part's worth respecting, but respecting a thing and fearing it aren't the same, Kale. One helps you plan, the other just makes you freeze." I thought about how frozen I had been 3 days earlier, unable to even reach for my harness buckle while the storm shook the dome around us, and I said nothing. We landed at Halvorn Ridge under a sky the color of wet stone, low gray clouds pressing down over a landscape of rolling hills, dense tree lines, and one particularly deep ravine that cut through the center of the valley like a scar. Commander Voss briefed us on the exercise parameters as we disembarked, his voice carrying the particular firmness of someone determined not to repeat the mistakes of the previous drill. "You will move in 3 cadet teams to your assigned shelter checkpoint before nightfall," he said. "Weather monitoring places a moderate rain system arriving within the next 2 hours, intensifying toward evening. This is manageable if you follow your assigned routes and avoid low ground near the ravine. I want every team checking in at each waypoint, no exceptions." I was assigned to a team with Finn and a quiet, serious cadet named Talia Brennan, a girl from a heavily forested world whose species had excellent tracking instincts but very little experience with open, exposed terrain like the ridge's upper slopes. Arya's team was assigned a separate route entirely, one that would keep us apart for most of the exercise, and I found myself unexpectedly unsettled by that fact as we set out. The first hour passed without incident. The terrain was steep but manageable, the air cool and smelling of wet earth and pine, nothing like the chaos of 3 days earlier. I almost let myself relax, almost let myself believe this exercise would pass quietly, uneventfully, exactly as planned. Then the rain arrived early. It started as a light patter against the leaves overhead, easy enough to ignore, but within 20 minutes it had thickened into a steady, insistent downpour that turned the trail beneath our boots into a slick, treacherous slope. Thunder rolled somewhere in the distance, not yet close, but close enough to make Talia's ears flatten against her skull in obvious distress. "We should find shelter," she said, raising her voice over the rain. "This isn't the storm from before, but it's getting worse fast." "Checkpoint 2 is another 20 minutes ahead," Finn said, checking the small device strapped to his wrist. "We should be able to make it before the worst of it." We should have. That is the frustrating truth of what happened next. We should have made it, if the rain had followed the pattern the instructors predicted, if the drainage channel beside our trail had not already been swollen from an earlier system nobody had accounted for, if Talia had not slipped exactly where she did, at exactly the moment a fresh surge of water came rushing down the channel beside us. I heard her cry out before I fully understood what had happened. One moment, she was walking just ahead of me, and the next, she was gone from the trail entirely, swept sideways into the drainage channel that had, in the space of a single downpour, transformed from a shallow gully into a fast, churning stream of brown water. "Talia!" Finn shouted, already scrambling toward the edge of the channel. I froze. I want to be honest about that because it is the truth, and because everything that happened afterward only makes sense if I admit it plainly. I stood there, rain hammering down around me, thunder rolling closer, and my entire body simply refused to move. My mind understood, in some distant, clinical way, that a fellow cadet was in danger, and that every second mattered. My body did not care what my mind understood. It had locked itself in place, exactly as it had 3 days earlier inside the flooding shelter deck. "Kale, help me." Finn's voice cracked with panic as he grabbed for a low-hanging branch, trying to reach Talia as the current carried her further downstream, toward a section where the channel narrowed and the water moved even faster. I forced my legs to move, finally, stumbling toward the channel's edge, my hands shaking so badly I nearly lost my own footing on the wet ground. By the time I reached Finn, Talia had been carried nearly 10 meters further away, her hands scrabbling uselessly at the slick banks, unable to find any purchase against the current. "The emergency beacon," I said, fumbling at my own uniform with clumsy, freezing fingers. "We need to call for—" "There's no time," Finn said, his voice tight with terror. "By the time anyone reaches us." A shape moved past us then, fast and low, cutting through the rain with none of the hesitation that had frozen the two of us in place. I registered dark, soaked hair, a familiar rain shell, and I understood, with a jolt that cut straight through my panic, that Arya's team's route must have crossed closer to ours than the instructor's maps had shown. "Move back from the edge," Arya called, not slowing down as she assessed the channel with the same quick, focused attention I had watched her give the storm 3 days earlier. "The bank's undercut here, it'll give way if you crowd it." She was already moving downstream along the bank, tracking Talia's position with an ease that made no sense given how fast the current was carrying her. I watched her calculate something, some invisible equation of water speed and channel width and the position of a fallen tree branch jutting out from the bank ahead, and then she simply acted on it, wading into the shallow edge of the current at an angle that put her directly in the path Talia would be swept along. "Grab the branch when you reach it," Arya shouted toward Talia, bracing herself against the fallen tree limb with both hands, positioning her own body as an anchor point in water that, even at its shallow edge, was clearly strong enough to threaten her footing. Talia, gasping and terrified, managed to twist herself toward the branch as the current carried her past, her hands closing around it with the desperate strength of someone who understood this was likely her only chance. Arya held firm, taking the sudden weight and momentum without being swept off her own feet, using the branch as a pivot point to guide Talia toward the shallower water near the bank. "That's it," Arya said, her voice calm and encouraging even as rain streamed down her face and the current tugged relentlessly at both of them. "You've got this. Just get your feet under you." It took perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt considerably longer, before Talia finally found solid footing in the shallows, and Finn and I were able to reach down and help pull her fully onto the bank, shaking, soaked, and coughing up water, but alive. Arya climbed out after her, entirely unhurried, as though she had just finished a pleasant swim rather than an emergency rescue in a flash-flooding drainage channel. "Everyone good?" she asked, looking between the three of us with genuine concern rather than the adrenaline-fueled urgency I would have expected. "You're asking if we're good," Finn said, his voice somewhere between disbelief and hysteria. "You just walked into a flood channel like it was a puddle." "It wasn't that deep," Arya said. "Fast-moving, sure, but shallow enough that the real danger was the current, sweeping her into the narrows further down, not drowning depth. Once I had an anchor point, it was mostly just physics." "Just physics," I repeated numbly. Talia, still catching her breath, looked up at Arya with an expression I recognized immediately, because I was fairly certain my own face had worn the same one 3 days earlier. It was the look of someone whose entire understanding of what was possible had just been quietly rewritten. "Thank you," Talia managed finally, her voice shaking. "Don't thank me yet," Arya said, already reaching for her comm unit to report the incident and request a medical check despite Talia's protests that she was fine. "We still need to get everyone to checkpoint before this storm decides to get serious." This was just the opening act. I looked up at the sky, where the clouds had continued to darken while we were focused entirely on the crisis at the channel's edge, and felt my stomach tighten at her words. "Wait," I said. "This isn't the storm yet." Arya followed my gaze upward, studying the clouds with the same calm, assessing expression she gave everything, and something in her posture shifted slightly, not into fear, but into a kind of focused attention that made me more nervous than any amount of visible worry would have. "No," she said slowly, "this is just the front edge of it. The real system is still about 40 minutes out, and if the pressure's dropping the way I think it is, it's going to hit a lot harder than what the instructors predicted." Thunder rolled again, closer now, and beneath the surface calm of her voice, I heard something else, something I had not expected to hear from her at all. Concern. "How much harder?" I asked. Arya looked at each of us in turn, Finn still catching his breath, Talia shivering despite the emergency blanket Finn had wrapped around her shoulders, and me, still trying to steady my own shaking hands. "Enough that we need to move now," she said. "And enough that I need all three of you listening very carefully to everything I say for the next 40 minutes, because this next part isn't going to be gentle." For the first time since I had met her, I did not need convincing. I simply nodded, and we moved. The 40 minutes that followed taught me more about survival than every lesson I had absorbed in 3 years at the academy combined. Arya moved us with a purpose that left no room for hesitation, and strangely, that certainty was easier to follow than fear would have been. She had us discard anything that would slow us down or catch wind like a sail, redistributing the weight of our gear so that Talia, still recovering from her fall into the channel, carried the lightest load. She chose our path along the higher ground rather than the marked trail, explaining as we moved that the marked route ran too close to the ravine's edge for what was coming. "The wind is going to hit from the coast side," she said, raising her voice as the rain thickened around us, and the light continued dropping despite it being nowhere near evening. "That ridgeline ahead will give us a break if we can reach it before the front arrives. After that, it's about finding solid rock, not trees. Trees come down, rock doesn't." "How do you know all this?" Finn asked, half shouting over a gust of wind that nearly staggered him sideways. "Because I've walked through worse than this, since I was younger than any of you," Arya answered, without a trace of boastfulness in her voice. Only plain fact. Keep moving. We're close. We reached a wide overhang of gray stone, jutting out from the ridge's upper slope, just as the true storm arrived, and I understood immediately why she had pushed us so hard to get there. The wind that followed was unlike anything from 3 days earlier, a solid physical force that bent trees at angles I would not have believed possible, tearing branches free and sending them tumbling across the open ground below us. Lightning struck somewhere close enough that I felt it in my teeth, and the accompanying thunder arrived almost instantly, a physical pressure against my chest. Arya had us positioned against the deepest part of the overhang, away from the opening, our backs to solid stone that the wind could not reach around. "This is as safe as it gets out here," she said, settling down beside us with the same unhurried calm she had carried through the entire ordeal. Now we waited out. For a long while, none of us spoke. The storm was too loud, too immediate, too consuming for conversation. I watched the world outside our shelter transform into something almost unrecognizable, rain moving sideways in solid sheets, lightning turning the darkened sky white for split seconds at a time, thunder rolling continuously rather than in distinct claps. Eventually, as the worst of it began to ease into something merely severe rather than overwhelming, Talia broke the silence. "How do you do this?" she asked Arya, her voice quiet but audible now that the wind had dropped enough to allow it. "Not just today, any of it. How does anyone live somewhere that does this regularly and not lose their mind from fear?" Arya considered the question for a long moment, before answering, watching the storm continue its work beyond the overhang's edge. "I think the honest answer is that you don't stop being afraid," she said. "Not really. You just learn what to do with the fear instead of letting it decide things for you. Where I'm from, everyone grows up learning that lesson early, because the alternative is not surviving very long." "Tell us about it," I said. "Your homeworld. I want to understand." Arya glanced at me, and something in her expression softened, like she recognized the question as genuine, rather than the nervous curiosity most cadets approached her with. "Earth isn't special because it's more dangerous than everywhere else," she said. "It's special because it's dangerous in so many different ways at once, and life there had to figure out how to survive all of them simultaneously. We have storms like this one, sure, but also earthquakes that can level entire cities without warning, predators that evolved specifically to hunt things our size, diseases that can end a life in days if you don't understand them, plants that will hurt you just for touching them, oceans that can swallow ships twice the size of this training academy. And people just live there," Finn said, something between disbelief and awe in his voice. "Just, ordinarily, going about daily life." "Ordinarily," Arya confirmed, a faint smile touching her mouth. "Most humans back home would probably laugh if you called any of that remarkable. It's just Tuesday for us. You grow up learning which plants to avoid, which sounds mean a storm is coming, how to read a wave before it breaks, how far to stay from something with teeth. It's not bravery, it's just knowledge, passed down until it becomes instinct. But you," I said, "the things you've done these past few days, that's not just knowing which plants to avoid, that's something else." Arya was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer. "I think," she said slowly, "the difference is that where you're from, danger is the exception. Something goes wrong, and it's treated as an emergency, a disruption to the normal order of things. Where I'm from, danger is the baseline. It's not treated as an emergency because it's simply how the world works. You don't panic about the ordinary shape of your own life. You just learn to move through it." I thought about Thren Prime, about the gentle climate towers keeping every city at a comfortable 22 degrees, about how the concept of a genuinely dangerous, unmanaged storm had been theoretical to me until 3 days earlier. I had never once had to learn the shape of real danger, because my entire world had been built specifically to prevent me from ever needing to. I used to think the word Deathworld was an exaggeration, I admitted, something dramatic humans called their planet for effect. Arya laughed softly at that, though there was no mockery in it. "It's not an exaggeration," she said. "It's just also not the whole story. Yes, Earth can kill you in more ways than most catalogued planets in the fleet database, but it also produces people who know how to survive every single one of those ways, because there was never any alternative. You don't get soft when the world refuses to be gentle with you." The storm continued to ease outside the overhang, thunder growing more distant, the wind settling into something closer to the strong but manageable weather I now understood most of the galaxy considered severe. Arya checked her comm unit and reported our position and status to Commander Voss, who responded with clear, evident relief in his voice, along with an order for us to remain sheltered until the extraction shuttle could safely reach our position. While we waited, I found myself studying Arya in a way I had not allowed myself to before, not as a curiosity or a rumor given human shape, but as a person who had simply grown up learning lessons the rest of us had never needed to learn. "Can I ask you something else?" I said. "You've been doing a lot of that lately," Arya said, though her tone was warm rather than annoyed. "Are you ever actually afraid? Not composed about being afraid. Actually afraid, the way the rest of us have been these past few days." Arya's expression grew more serious, and for a moment I thought I had finally found the question that would crack her calm exterior. Instead, she simply nodded. "All the time," she said. "I was afraid when Talia went into that channel. I was afraid of how fast that current was moving, and how easily it could have gone differently if I'd misjudged the anchor point by even half a second. I'm human, Kale, not fearless. The difference isn't that I don't feel it. It's that I've had a lot more practice not letting it stop my hands from doing what needs to happen." That answer settled something in me that I had been carrying since the moment I first saw her file, since the moment the word Deathworld had first crawled uncomfortably into my thoughts and refused to leave. I had spent days assuming her calm meant something alien, something beyond ordinary understanding. It was not that at all. It was simply fear that had been trained, over an entire lifetime, to become useful instead of paralyzing. "Thank you," I said, "for coming back for us. Your team's route wasn't supposed to cross ours." "It wasn't," Ari admitted. "I heard the channel flooding faster than the forecasts predicted, and I had a feeling someone's route was going to intersect with it at the wrong moment. Figured better safe than sorry." "You heard it," Finn repeated. "From how far away?" "Water sounds different when it's moving that fast," Arya said simply, as if this were the most ordinary observation in the world, rather than a skill none of us possessed. "You learn to listen for it." The extraction shuttle arrived roughly an hour later, once the storm had passed fully into the distance, leaving behind a washed, clean-smelling evening and a sky slowly clearing to reveal the first stars any of us had seen all week. As we boarded, Commander Voss met us at the ramp, his expression unusually thoughtful as he looked over the four of us, soaked, exhausted, and entirely unharmed. "I have reviewed the incident report from the drainage channel," he said, addressing Arya directly. "By every protocol in this Academy's handbook, your actions today constitute another unauthorized deviation from assigned procedure." "Understood, sir," Arya said, echoing her response from 3 days earlier, though this time with a faint, knowing smile. "I have also decided," Voss continued, "that given the outcome, and given that a cadet's life was very likely saved as a direct result of your judgment, this incident will be recorded as a successful field intervention rather than a violation. I am recommending you for a commendation." Arya's expression shifted into genuine surprise, the first time I had seen her caught off guard by anything since the moment we met. "I wasn't expecting that, sir." "Neither was I, Cadet. 3 days ago," Voss said. "But I find myself reconsidering a great many assumptions lately." As the shuttle lifted away from Halvorn Ridge, carrying us back toward the Academy, through a sky finally calm and clear, I found myself sitting beside Arya once more, watching the stars appear one by one through the viewport. "What happens now?" I asked her. "After the storms, after everything you've shown us these past few days?" Arya considered the question with the same easy thoughtfulness she gave everything. "Now," she said, "you all get to decide what you do with what you've learned. That's how it works. Nobody hands you courage. You build it, one storm at a time, until the shape of the danger stops being a mystery and starts being something you know how to move through." I looked out at the darkening landscape below us, at the ridge and its ravine and the storm-scarred trees, and for the first time since the training dome's alarms had first screamed 3 days earlier, I felt something other than fear settle into my chest. It felt, strangely, like the beginning of understanding. 3 weeks passed before the Academy scheduled what the senior instructors called the Crucible, the final trial that would determine which of us moved forward into active fleet service and which of us would need another full term of preparation. I had heard about the Crucible since my very first day at the Academy, always spoken of in hushed, nervous tones by older cadets who had already survived it, and always described the same way: unpredictable, unforgiving. The exercise where the Academy stopped protecting you from the galaxy and started teaching you how to survive it without that protection. This year, the Weather Monitoring Division had flagged something they had not seen approach the training grounds in over a decade, a converging storm system forming where 2 separate weather fronts were expected to collide directly over the exercise zone. Commander Voss addressed the assembled cadets the morning of the trial with a gravity I had not heard in his voice since the very first storm, 3 weeks, and what felt like a lifetime ago. "This exercise carries genuine risk," he said, standing before all 17 of us in the departure bay. "The storm system projected to arrive this afternoon exceeds the intensity of both prior weather events this term combined. I will not pretend otherwise. What I will say is that you are not the same cadets who stood in this bay 3 weeks ago." He was right, though I would not fully understand how right until the storm actually arrived. Our teams were reassigned for the Crucible, deliberately mixed so that no cadet would be paired with their usual partners. A decision the instructors explained was meant to test whether we could apply what we had learned independently, without relying on someone else's calm to anchor our own. I found myself paired with Talia, who had grown noticeably steadier since the Channel incident, and a new cadet named Owen Faircross, a quiet, careful boy from a world called Marrow, whose species had almost no experience with severe weather of any kind. Arya, I learned that morning, had been assigned to a different section of the exercise zone entirely, tasked with leading a small support team stationed at the primary shelter point rather than moving through the wilderness with the rest of us. When I asked Commander Voss about the change, he explained simply that the instructors wanted to observe whether the rest of us had genuinely absorbed the lessons of the past 3 weeks, rather than simply following her example without understanding it. "You won't have her to guide you through this one," Voss told me directly, before we departed. "You'll have to be the one who knows what to do." I did not feel ready for that responsibility. I want to be honest about that. 3 weeks of watching Arya move through danger with calm precision had taught me a great deal, but knowledge and instinct are not the same thing, and I had no way of knowing, standing in that departure bay, whether I had actually built the second from the first. The storm arrived earlier than predicted, as storms on this world seem to have a habit of doing, rolling in from the coast in a wall of dark cloud that swallowed the afternoon light within the space of 20 minutes. Our team had been moving through a section of dense forest when the first heavy rain began, and I felt the old, familiar tightness return to my chest as thunder rolled somewhere in the distance. "We should find higher ground," I said, and was surprised to hear my own voice come out steadier than I felt. "Away from any drainage channels. Arya taught me that much, 3 weeks ago." Talia nodded immediately, trusting the memory of that lesson without question. Owen, however, hesitated, his eyes wide with a fear I recognized clearly, because it was the exact fear I had carried during that first storm in the training dome. "How do you know which way is higher ground?" he asked, his voice tight. "Everything looks the same in this rain." I looked around at the darkening forest, at the way the rain was beginning to pool along certain low paths between the trees, and found, to my own surprise, that I actually did know the answer. "Water runs downhill," I said. "Watch where it's collecting fastest, and go the opposite direction. The ground rises that way, toward that outcrop of rock." I pointed toward a gray shape, barely visible through the thickening rain, remembering Arya's words from Halvorn Ridge without even trying to recall them. Trees come down, rock doesn't. We moved quickly, the rain intensifying around us with every passing minute, until we reached the shelter of an overhang not unlike the one that had protected us 3 weeks earlier. I positioned Owen and Talia against the deepest part of the stone, away from the wind, exactly as I had watched Arya do, and settled in beside them as the true force of the storm arrived. It was, without question, the worst weather I had ever experienced. Lightning struck close enough that the light and sound arrived almost simultaneously, over and over, and the wind howled through the forest below us with a force that sent entire trees crashing down in the distance. My hands were not entirely steady. My heart was not entirely calm, but my body did not freeze, not the way it had 3 weeks earlier, and I understood, somewhere in the middle of that realization, that something fundamental had actually changed in me. Owen was not so fortunate. I watched him press himself against the stone, his breathing coming in short, panicked bursts, his eyes squeezed shut against each fresh crash of thunder. I recognized every part of that fear, because it had been mine not so long ago. "Owen," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage, "look at me." He opened his eyes, and I saw in them the exact same helplessness I had carried inside the flooding shelter deck 3 weeks ago. "This storm isn't trying to hurt you," I said, echoing words I had heard from someone else entirely, but meaning them for the first time as my own. "It's just doing what storms do. The fear you're feeling right now, that's normal. It's not going to go away completely, but it doesn't have to be the thing that decides what happens next. You just have to give your hands something useful to do instead of letting the fear make the decision for you." "How do I do that?" Owen asked, his voice small. "You start by helping me watch the water level along that channel below us," I said, pointing toward a shallow depression at the base of the ridge, one that reminded me uncomfortably of the drainage channel from Halvorn Ridge. "If it starts rising too fast, we'll need to move further up before it becomes a problem. Just keep your eyes on it." "That's your job right now." It was a small thing, giving him a single, manageable task in the middle of an overwhelming situation, but I watched something in his posture ease slightly, his breathing steadying by fractions as his attention shifted from the storm's overwhelming scale to a single, concrete responsibility he could actually manage. We remained in that shelter for nearly 2 hours as the storm worked through its full intensity, and during that time, I found myself doing something I never expected to do 3 weeks earlier. I talked Talia and Owen through what I understood of the storm's likely progression, based entirely on lessons Arya had taught me without ever intending to teach me anything at all, simply by living through danger in front of me and explaining, patiently, what she saw and why. When the storm finally began to ease, and Commander Voss's voice crackled through our comm units, checking on team positions across the exercise zone, I felt something unfamiliar settle into my chest. Not the absence of fear exactly. Something closer to the thing Arya had described weeks earlier in that overhang at Halvorn Ridge. Fear that had learned what to do with itself. We were among the last teams extracted that evening, once the storm had passed fully, and the shuttle crews could safely navigate the debris-strewn landscape below. As our shuttle rose above the exercise zone, I could see Arya's shelter point in the distance, a cluster of lights near the primary extraction bay, and felt an unexpected eagerness to tell her what had happened in that overhang. I found her later that evening in the mess hall, sitting alone at a corner table, still in her field uniform, a data pad open in front of her that she was not actually reading. "I heard your team held position through the worst of the convergence," she said as I sat down across from her. "Voss mentioned it during the debrief, said you handled it well." "I had a good teacher," I said. Arya smiled, though it was quieter than her usual expression, more thoughtful. "I didn't teach you anything directly this time," she pointed out. "I wasn't even there." "You taught me plenty," I said. "I just didn't realize how much of it had actually stuck until I needed it without you standing next to me." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the mess hall gradually filling with other cadets returning from their own exercise zones, exhausted, soaked, but visibly steadier than any of us had been 3 weeks earlier after that first storm in the training dome. "Can I tell you something?" I said eventually. "You've made a habit of that," Arya said, amused. "When I first read your file, before I ever met you, the word Deathworld frightened me more than anything else in this entire program. I thought it meant something broken, something wild, something the rest of the galaxy should be afraid of." "And now?" Arya asked. "Now I think it just means you grew up somewhere that never let you pretend the danger wasn't real," I said. "And because of that, you learned things the rest of us are only now beginning to understand. I don't think Deathworld is a warning anymore. I think it's just where the people come from who end up saving the rest of us." Arya was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an expression I could not entirely read. Then she smiled, the same easy, genuine smile she had given the storm camera weeks earlier, the one that had first made me question everything I thought I understood about fear and danger and what it meant to survive them. "That's a generous way to put it," she said, "but I'll take it." The graduation ceremony took place 2 weeks later, under a clear evening sky that felt almost deliberately calm after everything the term had put us through. 17 cadets stood in formation as Commander Voss addressed the assembled instructors and families gathered for the occasion, his voice carrying the particular pride of someone who had watched a group of frightened, uncertain trainees become something considerably more capable than they had started out. "This term tested every cadet in ways our curriculum did not originally anticipate," he said, his gaze moving briefly toward Arya before continuing. "What we discovered, in the process, was that the greatest lesson this academy could offer was not something written into any training manual. It was watching one cadet demonstrate, through action rather than instruction, what it truly means to face danger without letting it decide who you become." As the ceremony concluded and the cadets began dispersing into the warm evening air, I found myself standing near the edge of the gathering, watching clouds gather on the far horizon, distant and gray, the first hint of another storm system still hours away from arrival. Arya appeared beside me, following my gaze toward the darkening sky. "Looks like another one's coming," she observed. "Looks like it," I agreed. I studied the clouds for a long moment, remembering the terror they would have caused me 3 months earlier, back when the word storm meant something abstract and theoretical, something my homeworld's climate towers existed specifically to prevent me from ever experiencing. That fear had not entirely disappeared. I did not think it ever fully would, and I had come to understand that this was not a failure on my part, but simply the honest, ordinary shape of respecting something genuinely dangerous. What had changed was everything surrounding that fear: the freezing, the paralysis, the absolute certainty that danger meant only helplessness. I looked at the distant clouds, felt the familiar flutter of nervousness settle into my chest, and found myself smiling anyway, unprompted, in a way that would have been impossible for me 3 months earlier. "The weather's perfect," I said, and meant it. Arya glanced at me, clearly recognizing her own words reflected back at her, and her smile widened into something genuinely pleased. "See," she said, "I told you it would start looking ordinary eventually." Somewhere far above us, thunder rolled softly across the horizon, distant and unhurried, and for the first time in my life, I did not flinch.